Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another Wednesday video. And in case you hadn't already guessed it from the title, but we have the great Jon Parshall back with us. He's over that way. And shockingly, we're not actually going to talk about Midway. Well,
Yay.
kind of are, but
Yeah,
a
a little bit.
little bit. But no, this is all in aid of, well, again, if you haven't guessed from the video title, 1942, and why it's probably the most important year of the war as far as everybody is concerned. And you might be thinking, well, how does that work? Because, well, Pearl Harbor was 1941, and Philippine Sea and all that is a still, and later Gulf is still to come. Well, stay tuned, and we shall find out. I mean, it's not like you haven't been working on this for a while, is it?
Right. Yeah. So this is this has been my 16-year Sisyphean project, rolling the rock uphill. Um, but the manuscript is now finished, and the book has been sold to Oxford University Press and will be coming out hopefully in the earlyish part of 2026. So yeah, the culmination of a lot of research and writing and teeth gnashing and that kind of thing on my part. So, and I should say too that the book actually starts on December 5th,
Mhm.
1941, because that makes for a good sort of narrative entry point in that you've got the Russian counterattack outside Moscow, and then, of course, 2 days later, Pearl Harbor,
Yeah.
at which point all the big dogs are in, and now
Mhm.
we can really start to sort out who's going to win this war. So that really is the scope of my book is the
Mhm.
13 months inclusive from December 41 to December 42. But I
And
do think it is the most important year in the war.
And obviously, the book as a whole is going to be looking at not just the naval element, is it? It's going to be looking at
Correct.
the air and the ground and how it all
You
plays
got
into
it. Yeah, I'm basically looking at the entire year, the entire war, talking about how the Allies turned around their train wrecks that
it.
year.
Mhm.
How did that happen? Because
Yeah.
there were a lot of them that needed turning around, and there's a lot of stuff going on under the hood. And as you know, I'm a big picture guy, I'm a doctrine kind of guy, and so I'm unsatisfied with explanations. Fast forward to a place like Stalingrad, and you typically hear these tropes around, well, stiffening Russian resistance. It's like, well,
Mhm.
what does that mean? How did their resistance stiffen? What were the mechanisms behind that? What sort of military transformations were taking place in the Red Army that enabled them to go from this organization of basically Keystone cops at in the middle of 1941 to an outfit that can actually counterattack against the Wehrmacht at the end of 42. There's a
Mhm.
lot of stuff that has to happen to make that feasible. So same thing, in the naval war too. There's a lot of things going on, and that's kind of what I wanted to show up and yak with you about today.
Yeah. So luckily for everyone who's watching this, we're not going to be going into the nitty-gritty of Stalingrad, at least not this time. We are going to focus on the things that float and the things that we didn't want to float.
Yeah.
I guess well, probably a good place to start. How is the Allied situation going at the start of 1942? I mean, obviously Pearl Harbor's not doing quite so good at that point in time,
Yeah.
but it's not really looking much better for everybody else either.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, how many different words do you have for bad? I mean, that would be the appellation that we would want to apply to the beginning of yeah,
Mm,
1942 and sort of the predecessor to that. And I think one of the things that gets lost, particularly for Americans, is we, of course, over focus on what's happening on Pearl Harbor, and
mm,
understandably so. But if you take a look at what the Royal Navy has gone through in the last little bit, it is also really, really dreadful. So let's see. Ark Royal is sunk on 13th November
mm,
in the Mediterranean. The Barham gets blown up on the 25th of November, right after that. 19 December, Force K, which is sort of the cruiser raiding force that's in Malta, gets absolutely mauled and runs into a minefield off of Libya. The Neptune goes down with only one survivor, and it's a hot mess. A few hours after that, some Italian frogmen sneak into Alexandria, attach limpet mines, and put the Queen Elizabeth and Valiant out of business. One of them is going to be out of business for 6 months, the other for a year and a half. So they're sitting on the bottom in Alexandria Harbor. Um, so at this point, Force H out in Gibraltar is down to just the old battleship Malaya. The force that's in Alexandria now has basically three light cruisers to its name. The carriers that used to be, it was the fact that in 40 and 41, for the majority of that year, basically there were two squadrons at either end of the Mediterranean that had two or three battleships and a carrier, and that had been sufficient to keep the Italian Navy mostly in check. But when we come into the beginning of this ordeal, now the Italians basically are going to have not naval supremacy, but the ability to operate with relative impunity. And that's going to go on throughout the majority of this year, which makes the Mediterranean really, really interesting. You've got the sort of east-west communication lines that the British have to keep open, as opposed to the north-south lines that the Italians are trying to keep open. So anyway, and then of course, Prince of Wales and Repulse get shellacked on 10 December. So by the time you get to that bit, the Royal Navy now, in the course of this war as a whole, has lost three aircraft carriers, five battleships or battle cruisers, nine cruisers, and 43 destroyers. It has not been a good run. And then you look at Pearl Harbor, we lose five battleships there, three permanently, three more damaged that are going to be sent stateside for repair. And so one of the points that Alan Zim makes in his Pearl Harbor book is that in about a 1 month time period, the Royal Navy and the US Navy between them have lost 38% of their operational capital ships, either sunk or damaged and under repair at this point. I mean, that's a stunning figure when you think about it, just how badly that, speaks to,
Mm.
the impairment of our striking force. Because of course, at this point in the war, the coin of the realm is battleships, and we've just lost a truckload of them.
Yeah. And I'm
So,
thinking particularly fast capital ship wise, we're really in trouble at that point because if with Prince of Wales going down and with Repulse, that and Hood obviously earlier in the year against Bismarck, that
right,
basically means the Royal Navy's down to King George V and Renown operational. Duke
right.
of York maybe kind of in the state Prince of Wales was in when she went out against Bismarck, kind of in a pinch maybe, but not really.
Working up, right.
Yeah. And the US is trying to figure out why North Carolina and Washington are acting like washing machines with bricks thrown in every time they go up to speed.
Just problems with their skags. And I should point out in that respect, though, that the only reason that Force Z, though, was even a thing was
Mm,
because there was now an American fast battleship up at Scapa Flow that was
mm,
supposedly acting as a counterweight to Tirpitz. So, we're really kind of threadbare, I guess I would
mm,
say at this point. The other thing I point out too is that it could have been worse. So if you look at Pearl Harbor, for instance, Maryland and Tennessee got hit by exactly the same type of heavy bombs that demolished Arizona. And yet they got lucky, that some of these bombs had bad fuses. Another one of them, I think, bounced off the front plate of one of the turrets. We could have easily walked out of that attack with not one Arizona, but three Arizonas, or certainly two. I mean, these were not
mm.
fluke hits. We both those ships got hit by those bombs, and they just didn't do what they were supposed to do. So we could have lost two more battleships there with no problem at all. Furthermore, if you look at the allocation of dive bombers in the second wave attack at Pearl Harbor, if the Japanese had stopped over focusing on Nevada and instead gone after, there were four big, juicy cruisers sitting in the repair basin area.
Mm.
all nuzzled up next to each other, and all four of those ships are going to go on to have very active duty in the Solomons later on in this year. So we could have walked out of Pearl Harbor, down another couple battleships and down two, three, four more cruisers too. That would have been really bad. Obviously, at Alexandria, you know, the Italians could have sunk one or both of Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. Just because they got away with being damaged doesn't mean that they couldn't have been blown to kingdom come. That could have happened. And then fast forwarding to April, I would say that there was a real potential for another disaster in the Indian Ocean when Nagumo comes calling with five aircraft carriers and is raiding Ceylon and places like that. I mean, sure, he ends up sinking the Hermes, he ends up sinking Cornwall and Dorsetshire, but a lot of people don't know that during that latter action, um, Somerville's force is out at sea and they are watching this dive bomber attack going down on their radar set. So they are
Mm.
just over the horizon to the southwest. If the Japanese had caught them, you've got two modern carriers there, the Formidable and the Indomitable. You've got the Warspite and you got four old wheezy R-class battleships. You know, those two modern carriers between them don't even have 100 aircraft, and Nagumo's got over 400, and they are better airframes too. And I hate to say it, but better pilots, at the stick as well. Somerville was, if that comes to a fleet engagement, my crystal ball isn't all that big, but my money is heavily on Nagumo sinking all seven of those ships. And now what the hell,
Mm. Yeah,
So,
that whole scenario, I did it when I did a couple of videos on it, and it's a really bizarre situation because, like you say, when those valves are going over, Force A is just watching the radar, going, "Please don't turn left, please don't turn left, please don't
turn
turn
left.
left."
Yeah.
But then the flip side, you have that almost run in with Hiryu and Soryu unescorted, running into Warspite and company at night, and it's that almost
Good
dichotomy
point.
of if Japan finds and hits the British during the day, it's basically
Post.
game over.
Yeah.
Um, but if the British find the Japanese at night, the Japanese have a night fighting doctrine. They don't have a surface night fighting doctrine for carriers. um,
Right. Yeah.
uh, which
Yeah.
it always that particular scenario always makes me rather amused because yes, you've got Warspite, and let's face it, honestly, it probably would have been like Cape Matapan Mark II, um, but or maybe use some radar equipped swordfish to drop some torpedoes. But there is always the slightly amusing thing of if they'd all stuck together, then the two British carriers might have ended up having to chip in to finish off Hiryu and Sorry with their
Right.
4.5-inch guns, which would technically mean the first carrier versus carrier battle was a surface gun action, which would have
Right.
completely confused the heck out of everybody
Yeah.
from
Right.
then on.
Yeah. That would mess with our brains for years.
You can imagine them desperately refitting the 8-inch back onto the
Right.
Saratoga.
Just throw everything at them. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay. So maybe you painted a more optimistic scenario there
Yeah.
than I would, but
But as you say, like if it had happened during the daylight, all it takes is one rogue Japanese scout aircraft, and
dear Lord,
that's it.
yeah, yeah. So I guess the overall picture then, just
Mm,
between the capital ships on these two navies, there was the potential for much more badness.
mm,
Meanwhile, just in general in the Pacific, of course, the first 4 or 5 months of this war are just absolutely disastrous for the Allies. Um, the Asiatic squadron is just wiped out, essentially,
mm,
and obviously the Abda flotilla is exterminated down around Java. So, that's a hot mess.
mm.
And once you put that together with then the Indian Ocean raid, the end result is the Royal Navy gets kicked out of the Indian Ocean. They have to rebase to Mombasa. When was the last time something like that happened?
Yeah.
I mean, that I think is just that's terrifying. I mean, the white ensign has ruled the world's oceans for generations. When was the last time there was essentially an open invitation to a stand-up fight and the Royal Navy just couldn't do it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean it's because I've been looking at this recently actually as of time of recording. I've just released a video on the strategy and setup of the Indian Ocean Theatre up to the end of 1941, and it's interesting how at that point the Royal Navy is basically on Plan D or Plan E.
Okay.
Because Plan A had been like cruiser and submarine warfare out of way highway, attack the Japanese in their home waters, and then they're going, yeah, demands
And
of war back home. Okay, maybe we'll try and hold them at Hong Kong and Singapore. Yeah, that didn't work out so well. Maybe we'll fall back to Ceylon. Yeah, the Nagumo's just proved that's probably not such a brilliant plan. And then they look very briefly at potentially basing out of India, and then they realize that that's not actually all that for much further.
yeah,
And much as Ceylon is and Colombo are not really brilliant naval bases, they did have at least a modicum of defense. No one's bothered to install anti-aircraft batteries and fighter squadrons in mainland India.
yeah,
And then oh well, I guess we'll have to go to the other side. There's this whole list of sort of alternate bases, and then like, well, we can go to Kenya or we can go to South Africa, and that's pretty much it.
much yet.
And then they decide the next best thing to do is beat up on the Vichy French in Madagascar because
Right.
they're up until that point everyone had been happy to ignore Madagascar, and then they're like, well, you know what? All it would take at this point is a Japanese squadron
So,
to pressure
yeah,
either pressure or be welcomed by the Vichy French to base there, and that's it. We're stuffed.
yeah, we're stuffed. And it's important to realize that, of course, the sea lines of communication that not only go to India but also go to the Middle East, which are keeping Auchinleck's army supplied in the desert. All of that stuff runs up the east coast of Africa. And as you say, if the Japanese were lucky enough to base a squadron of submarines in Madagascar, you've got a real problem on your hands. I do think that the Japanese looked 10 feet tall at the beginning of the war. And I honestly don't think that they really had any ability from a logistical standpoint to do something like that. But given the fact that, the war has been a dumpster fire up until this point, you can understand why Churchill was somewhat uptight about, the fact that something like that could happen. And
Hmm.
then, yeah, all of a sudden you got this plan for Operation Ironclad. Likewise, one of the sort of the classic counterfactuals has always been, well, what would have happened if the Japanese had decided to go after the British in India rather than after the Americans in the Central
Hmm.
Pacific? And that was a favorite scenario of H.P. Wilmot, for instance. He thought that that could be a very heavy blow against the British Empire, potentially could drive the British from the war. I have real difficulties with that as well. The Japanese didn't have a lot of amphibious lift just to begin with. Are they really going to be able to get multiple divisions across the breadth of the Indian Ocean into a place like Ceylon and then keep them in supply over a water line that is, I don't forget what it is. It's about 1,500 miles from Singapore out to
Hmm.
Ceylon. You fast forward to the campaign that they're gonna fight in the Solomon Islands, man, they could barely keep a supply line open the 600 miles from Rabaul down to Guadalcanal. Granted, the situation down there was a little goofy in terms of this one air base, meaning that sea control shifted every 12 hours, but to an extent, you kind of have the same thing going in Ceylon too. I don't know. So um, it's important not to sort of overestimate the Japanese ability to project power that far. But there's no question that the Allied decision makers, when you're looking in the March-April timeframe, are just like, Jesus Christ, this is a hair on fire emergency because particularly for the British, the Middle East really is the one theater in which they have the ability to make significant contributions to the war as a whole. It's the one place that their army has a chance of performing reasonably well against the German Italian army group that's there. If the Middle East falls, man, that's like the connective tissue for the entire empire, and that would have just been a disastrous blow to British fortunes at that point. So yeah,
Yeah.
things are bad. Things
Yeah,
are
and
bad.
of course we've got the Middle Eastern oil fields as well. I mean, they're not on the
Right.
scale of the US oil fields, but they're very useful for keeping the British in fuel oil, especially in that area.
in
and
that area.
something that the
That's
Axis really wants control of.
right. That's absolutely right. Although the majority of British crude actually is coming from Venezuela at this
Mm,
point. But that in turn leads to the other dumpster fire that is happening, which is Paukenschlag, you
mm,
know. Um, and I'm very interested in your perspective on that as well,
mm,
because I spend a lot of time on this in this 42
mm.
tome, and I end up giving Admiral King actually relatively good grades for his performance during that time. I'm not saying that
Mm.
it wasn't ugly, but you tend not to get that sort of a charitable view for most British observers.
Yeah,
I have
but this is
noted.
actually quite funny because when I did my video on Admiral King, I was really interested to try and work out where his hatred of the British, or apparent hatred of the
I
British,
don't.
seemed to come from,
Well,
and
let's talk
when
about that. Go
yeah,
ahead.
so well the thing is, on the one hand, the closest I could find as to why he would hate the British, or at least the British establishment, which to be fair, most British people hate as well, seems to come down to Admiral Beatty, which is great because I love hating on Beatty, so it gives me another
Right.
reason to hate on him. It all goes back to the late First World War, where King is an attaché to the American admiral who's been sent over with to observe what's going on
Right.
in Europe. So he's placed on the Queen Elizabeth with Beatty during a fleet exercise in the late World War One period,
Yeah.
and of course, so he's being put there and told, right, this is Admiral Beatty. He's in command of the Grand Fleet. He led the battle cruisers at Jutland, and of course, at that point, there's this whole propaganda thing going around, so that no one's quite knows how badly that had gone. With the battle cruisers, and so King's being told, yeah, this is the institution of naval power. They go on this fleet exercise, split the Grand Fleet in two, and of course Beatty can't really command his way out of a wet paper bag when it comes to fleet actions, and he's rather stupidly put the other half of the fleet in command of Admiral Sturdy, who was the one who went down with the battle cruisers and kicked Scharnhorst and Gneisenau 6 ways from
Right.
Sunday at the Falkland Islands, who shockingly enough actually has a decent grasp of tactics.
Right.
A fog descends and visibility is reduced. So theoretically, at this point, you should be using your cruisers and destroyers to scout and find out where the enemy is. Beatty fails to do any of this, throws a bit of a temper tantrum, and just basically complains that he can't possibly win. And sure enough, when the fog lifts, Sturdy's got Beatty's half of the fleet surrounded and dead to rights. Because it turns out, yes, you can actually navigate in the fog if you know what you're doing.
If you know what you're
Um,
doing.
and instead of going, okay, you know what, fair cop, well done, Sturdy, Beatty throws even more of a temper tantrum, calls off the entire exercise, and goes home.
Yeah.
At
Okay.
which point King is like, okay, and this is supposed to be the person in command of the greatest navy that ever lived.
Right.
And
Yeah.
he seems to have a negative attitude for some reason to British high commanders after that. But then the flip side, again, when I was looking at what's happening with the when the Germans rock up, is that for the most part, King's actually making fairly good points, and most of his points seem to center around, yeah, convoys would be a really good idea, except for if we have unescorted or poorly escorted convoys and they get caught by submarines. That's the worst possible situation.
They get ripped to pieces, which has
Yeah.
happened on a number of occasions, and
Mm.
he's seen that. Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
and he looks at his fleet list and just goes, "We don't have enough escorts." At which point, yeah, it's going to suck if we send ships out as normal. They are going to get picked off left, right, and center, but that's the least worst option until we can churn out a bunch more escorts to deal with the situation.
Yep. Yep. No, that's basically where I come down to. Let me put in some comments. I don't view King as someone who hates the British. I view King, and Trent Hone is in my camp on this one as well, or I should say I'm probably in Trent Hone's camp because he's working on a new biography of King.
Mm-hmm.
King is virulently pro US Navy.
Mm-hmm.
He is massively competent at pretty much everything he does. He is a freak about having clear lines of communication and organization and control. And so he doesn't like muddied up org charts and that kind of thing. I think you're right. If he does not respect Beatty, that's the end of the relationship there. And I do think that the same thing is true between King and Pound. He does not
Mm.
respect Dudley Pound because, and this was a thing that was pointed out by a Canadian historian, a guy named Ken Hansen, wrote an article on Paukenschlag, and he's like, when King was commander of the Atlantic Fleet immediately prior to the war, he had put forward a number of suggestions for how the escorting arrangements could be rearranged to be more fuel efficient and take advantage of the fact that U.S. ships had longer legs and blah, 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 blah.
Mm.
But it would have meant that on occasion there would be situations where British warships would be under an American commander, and Pound was like, that ain't happening. And King ends up being just like, okay, well, you're dead to me because I know that from a logistical standpoint, these suggestions make sense. And in fact, a number of them will end up being implemented later on. But yeah, King doesn't have a lot of second chances in him for a person. You know, if you've proven yourself to be an idiot, you're dead to me. That's kind of
Yeah.
how he rolls. Your point about escorts is absolutely right on the money. And that is the fundamental driver for everything that happens in the first 3 months of Paukenschlag. Because when the balloon goes up, the British are in a situation where I don't want to put it in the you guys are sending divisions, but you know you're my convenient foil in that regard. So I'm just saying, you guys were sending divisions to the Far East and the Middle East. So you've got like 18th Infantry Division that was ostensibly on its way to the Middle East, and it's going to get rerouted and it's going to end up in Singapore and get captured there in the last days of that dumpster
Mm.
fire. Um, well, what that means is that now there's a crying need for manpower in Britain itself. And so the Brits are crying for us to start bringing divisions over to the UK. And we're like, cool, we'll do that. Those troop convoys are escorted within an inch of their life. A lot of them are being escorted by some of our older battleships like Texas and New York, because we don't want, any monkey business with Scharnhorst or one of those cats showing up and, that's not going to happen on our watch. They have a lot of destroyers with them as well. Because King is making an intentional calculus here. He's like, yeah, it sucks to have to accept a slow dribble of dead merchant mariners, but I absolutely will not tolerate losing a regiment of drowned American boys if one of those troop transports goes down. It's just not going to happen. And so the end result is that a lot of our escorts are being dedicated to those troop convoys. I will point out, too, and this is mean of me, we did not lose a single troop transport during 1942. The British lose 7 troop transports with almost 3,000 lives lost. Granted, a lot of them were Italian
Mm.
POWs in the case of Laconia, but anyway, a lot of those ships were sailing unescorted in places like down by South Africa and whatnot because whose admiralty is more competent, I guess I would say, in that respect, in terms of demanding that if you're going to sail unescorted, you've got to have a top end speed of at least 16 knots, and you got to do that. You got to be zigzagging, no monkey business here. Anyway, so that's one thing that's happening. A lot of escorts are being used for those troop convoys. Two, obviously, a number of those escorts are being used for the heavy units that we are putting up in Scapa Flow to, keep the bad boogeyman,
Mm.
Tirpitz at bay. We're also taking the Wasp and running Spitfires into Malta, not once but twice. And you can imagine what King thought about that, having to send this relatively small carrier into this Stuka infested lake. That was the last thing in the world that he wanted to have to do. But and two, Operation Ironclad, Madagascar. When you guys go down and capture Madagascar, that means that a lot of the heavy units from Force H and also from Scapa are suddenly gone, and we get left minding the store. So and that's all good. This is how coalition warfare works. Each partner is trying to pick up the slack for the other partner, and I think that both sides were dealing with each other in good faith. I'm not saying that anybody's a bad guy here, but when you look at sensationalist accounts like Michael Gannon's Operation Drumbeat, where he's just absolutely scandalized what happens off the eastern coast of the U.S. in terms of sinkings, I don't think that there's enough emphasis put on the other obligations that were being created for the U.S. Navy during this time frame that required a huge amount of escorts to be used in other roles, which necessarily meant that there wasn't enough left off the East Coast proper to do what they needed to do.
Yeah, and
So
that's without even touching on the Pacific because we haven't had Coral Sea or Midway yet, but there are carrier raids going on. You've got to keep Pearl Harbor resupplied.
yeah,
There's the somewhat questionable idea of sending the poor old New Mexico's patrolling up and down the West Coast just in case there's a Japanese invasion army coming there. But that all eats up escorts as well, because there's one thing the Japanese have in spades, it's long-range submarines.
right. So there's some other things that come into play here as well. So people sort of point the finger as like, well, why didn't we lay down more destroyer escorts? And it's like, well, I hate to break it to you, but King actually wanted to do that, but was overruled by the president, among
Hmm.
others. That if you look at the Two Ocean Navy Bill, which was passed in July of 1940, which is going to end up funding the vast majority of this enormous battle fleet that we
Hmm.
will have in 1944, most of that money was spent on what I would call long lead term items. I mean, we're spending on battleships and heavy cruisers and carriers. We are neglecting the funding and construction of smaller hulls because we know that we can build those faster in a pinch if we need to. So that means that a lot of the stuff that King wanted from an ASW perspective was not ending up funded, and we don't end up laying down the keel of our first destroyer escort until the end of 1942.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, FDR has in mind that we're going to build these little 168-foot long sub chasers, and that's going to be the magic bullet. That he had this program called 60 ships in 60 days. We're handing out contracts to marinas that had been building yachts and stuff like that. Commercial yards, not naval yards. Just crank these suckers out. And it doesn't go well, and we don't get the number of ships off the ways that we think that we're going to. And when we do get these ships out there, it turns out, guess what? 165-foot ship will not get it done in the North Atlantic, baby. And just no way, you know. It's just too small. Those seas are too rough. And as the British had discovered themselves, even a ship like a Flower class corvette, that's a great ship, but it too is really a touch too small for operations in that particular environment. You really need a ship that's about 300 feet and is optimized for seakeeping and that kind of stuff, which points to another thing too. Destroyers are really not what you want to be hunting submarines with. They're optimized for top end speed and war fighting capability. They're dreadfully expensive, so we want those units to be operating with our main fleet units and getting into, fracases with actual worthy opponents rather than spending their time, poodling around at 11 knots in the North Atlantic, watching out for U-boats. That's dumb.
Yeah.
So anyway, what I'd like to suggest is that Paukenschlag, yes, it was dreadful. It resulted in a lot of sunk shipping, and I absolutely understand that from the British standpoint, the first happy time had really drawn down the national reserves in terms of petroleum and food reserves and that sort of thing. Larder back in the UK at this point in time is pretty bare. And so now you've got this situation where the merchant sinkings are just going bazonkers off of the US, 400,000 tons, 500,000, holy crap, 600,000 tons in June. So for the British, this is a legitimate hair on fire emergency. And I don't want to minimize that. I mean, they are, pressing every emergency button they can find, to let the Americans know that this is bad. This is really, really bad. You need to do something because, as Roger Wynne, the commander of the U-boat room, said to an American party, the problem is that a lot of these ships that are being sunk are ours. It'd be
Hmm.
one thing if it was just your ships you're losing, but it ain't. So anyway,
Yeah. So it's always really interesting actually looking at that whole situation because to me, um, King, I would say, to me at least personally, King seems to be the same kind of ruthless pragmatism that you see in people like Fletcher and Spruance, um, who actually I both think are massively underrated, really effective admirals.
Yeah.
Um, his weakness seems to be that he seems to couple that with occasionally some of the short fuse temperament of Halsey, um, and then gets locked into it. So you get this situation where at this point he's making really the right call. He's not making it's not a good call, but it's the least worst call because there isn't a good call to make.
Right.
Um, but then it kind of continues later on to the point that 2 years later when the Atlantic is crawling with escorts, he turns around and says, well, there's nothing we can learn from the British about anti-submarine warfare escorts, and I forbid you from trying. And it's like, yeah, okay, now you've taken it a bit too far. But
I
then
agree.
again, the sort of the inventiveness of the US escort captains at that point, because they're just like, well, you know what, we're here in Liverpool, it's Sunday, everybody can have a day off on leave. And if we happen to choose to take our leave and go over to Western Approaches Command and learn what
Right.
they're all doing, then, well, there's nothing
Yes.
anyone can say about it.
Right.
And
No.
King is at least bright enough to, draw the line. Oh, yeah, you know what? If you want to waste your time with the British in your own personal time, that's on you.
Right. I think that's fair. I do think that he does suffer from a not invented here syndrome, that is, he's not going to believe anything from the British until it's been confirmed by our own operational analysis teams and that sort of thing. I absolutely grant you. I will also ding him for not having instituted convoying at least for tankers relatively early on. But there's a bizarre timing thing here that we have to keep in mind. King was commander of the Atlantic Fleet, but he is then made commander in chief of the Atlantic Fleet and the Pacific Fleet in early December. But I don't think he actually has authority over the naval districts on the East Coast, which were in charge of a lot of the actual sub hunting operations. It's only when he takes over as chief of naval operations in March of 1942 that I think now he's got the ability to actually order those people to do things. And this is a point again that Trent is kind of mulling on, that the command lines here were a little bit wonky at this point in time. It is true too that the Americans just in general were terribly slow in just ramming things down the throats of like mayors on the East Coast, Atlantic City. No, goddamn it, you're going to turn your lights off. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. This is just not okay. You're going to do this. So it really took a while for us to get our civilian sector onto a wartime footing. And, from the British perspective, and it's just like, what is wrong with you? And you have every right to be understandably upset about that.
Yeah. Well, it's yeah, a lot of it is here. It's the different systems of government in the UK. If central government says you will do this because it's a wartime emergency, you do that. And then in the States, it's I suspect a lot of it was probably you know British admirals going, but the federal government has said you need to switch your lights off. Why aren't you switching your lights off? And
Yeah.
the states are like that's not how it works. There's like a whole like
A
federal
whole
states,
nother layer. Yeah.
etc., etc.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of weird. The other thing I would say too, fast forwarding,
Mm,
when if you look at the Battle of the Atlantic over the course of the year, I mean, to an extent, this is a desperation play on the part of Donuts, in that he is really starting to sort of lose the war on the North Atlantic convoy lines. I would argue that you look at what happens during 1941, and it's not great for the Germans. I mean, they lose a number of their big aces. Otto Kretschmer is captured, um, and so the beginning of the war then allows Donuts to spread the field, if you will, and go and operate in areas that have no prepared defenses. The cost of that, of course, is I've got to figure out how to get a Type 7 U-boat all the way across the freaking Atlantic Ocean. I'm running on one shaft at 5 knots. It takes me 2.5. I mean, these are miserable transits to get over and back, but And then he introduces milch cows, which give him a little more operating range. And the 9C is a better boat for that too, obviously. Um, but what ends up happening is things are solidifying on the eastern coast of the U.S. by about the April-May timeframe, and then he moves submarines into first the Caribbean and then into the Gulf of Mexico. They raise holy hell. They just absolutely rip the tankers up down there because that's where all the oil is, right? Texas and
Yeah.
Venezuela. But by the end of around August or so, the defenses now have congealed sufficiently that Donuts realizes that he can no longer really operate in these areas economically. He's still going to send boats out there every so often just to keep us honest. But now the main emphasis of the war ends up moving back onto the North Atlantic lines again. And now we suddenly come face to face with the old bogeyman, the Black Gap, right? The air gap up around Iceland and Greenland. And there's a lot of finger pointing that goes on towards King on that. Why didn't you cough up more VLR liberators sooner to, close that gap down? That's King's fault. And there's a number of problems with that thesis too. First, the B-24 Liberator is not produced for King. It's being produced for a guy named Hap Arnold. If you want B-24 Liberators, you got to go talk to Hap to get them, okay? They're not King's airplanes. That's the first problem. Second issue is that there's nothing magical about a B-24 from a VLR patrol plane standpoint. Yes, given the design of the Davis wing and its better laminar airflow and that kind of stuff, it's going to be a more long-ranged platform than something like, say, a Halifax. But the British had a world-class aviation industry of their own. And had the situation been dire enough, it's not a Halifax, a Sterling. That's really what
Mm.
they should have gone. Sterlings are hot trash over Germany. These things, they've got a ceiling of like 11,000 feet. They're garbage for trying to do strategic bombing. And this was recognized by the time we get to 1942. They're trying to get them out of service as rapidly as possible. There's nothing preventing the RAF from converting a bunch of Sterlings, shoving the extra fuel tanks and offloading the guns and that sort of nonsense and patchworking together some VLR libs of their own or VLR Sterlings of their own if they'd wanted to. But of course, that requires going up against Bomber Harris to get those airframes when he takes over in February. And nobody wants to do that, right?
Yeah, and as you say,
So,
the Sterling makes a lot of sense because it's actually got the compared to the Halifax, it's got the longer range, and
right.
so, depending on the model of Lancaster, it's even potentially longer range than some of the Lancasters. So it makes perfect sense to use it. But yeah, like you say, the RAF is just going, no, bombers, 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 and even the first B-24s that end up over in the UK, the first thing they do is, yeah, let's see if we can throw them into bombing Germany a bit more.
Right.
And then they're like, well, they're not quite as survivable as the B-17s and the Lancasters. And then at that point, the RAF's like, oh, well, maybe we can let them have a few.
Yeah.
Poor old coastal commander's like, yay, we got a modern aircraft that's actually
Right.
been designed this decade.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually some pretty good recent scholarship that has pointed out that the air gap really wasn't properly appreciated until about October of 42. And then everybody's like, holy mare, we're in
Mm.
deep weeds here. We got to fix this problem. Um, the first VLR Liberator conversions were actually done by a Scottish aviation company. So again, there's plenty of technical expertise to make this happen had the desire been there to take existing airframes and turn them into those purposes. That didn't end up happening. So again, um, I would like the finger of blame that is traditionally pointed at King when it comes to VLR libs to be pointed in other directions because there were plenty of other people that were kind of culpable for that.
Mm.
So
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've never quite understood that myself because the minute you say B-24, you think US Air Force B-24. I'm pretty sure Admiral King was not part of the US Air Force.
thank you. Yeah. I mean, and of course, Hap Arnold likewise was afflicted by exactly the same strategic bombing over focus that Bomber Harris was. I mean, I think the world of Hap Arnold. I think he was a tremendous leader. He did a lot of good things, but it was extremely difficult for King to be able to pry B-24s out of his cold dead hands too. So, there's again, there's a lot of people that have to be managed here. It's not just King making these decisions.
Yeah. So I guess that we've kind of established, yeah, things are not going well for the
Things
Allies.
not maybe we should move on to
Yeah.
okay, how do we fix the things?
Yeah. So do they? I guess at that point it's like, do they have an idea of what's going wrong, or are they just sitting there going, huh, huh? And
I
if they
don't
do have an idea, are they going, well, we need to do this, this, and this to fix it?
I don't see it as any sort of centrally controlled or monolithically organized approach to fixing these problems, among other things, because the type of tactical problems that we're running into are so different from theater to theater to theater. I mean, the Atlantic is primarily focused on the U boat. How do we deal with the U boat? The Atlantic is focused really on logistics. How do we interdict enemy logistics and keep our own alive in some fashion? The Pacific very rapidly gets focused onto carrier warfare, and these are all very different kettles of fish, which again should give us some sympathy, I guess, for the decision makers like King and Pound who are trying to juggle, this global dumpster fire and trying to figure out how do we put the right assets in the right places and make the innovations that we need to make. um Obviously in terms of the Atlantic, the key there is just getting better equipment into the ships, and we've got to get better centimetric radar. We've got to get more HFDF sets into these things. We got to get better tactics. Obviously, you get innovators like Johnny Walker are just starting to literally kill it, when it comes to tactical developments. I mean, that guy was a genius. Um, but it's very difficult to get that equipment doled out as quickly as we want. And I hate to say it, but the people that are really on the short end of the stick are the Canadians. That, here they are essentially becoming responsible for most of the Western Atlantic. And this is a Navy that is expanding just tremendously to try to, pick up this burden. And I hate to say it, but the Royal Navy treats them in many cases really kind of contemptuously. They don't have a lot of good things to say about the Canadians. I'm sure they didn't have a lot of good things to say about our escort groups either. But there wasn't anything that was inherently wrong with a lot of these Canadian escorts that wouldn't have been fixed if they hadn't had, Type 284 radars and better sonars and that kind of stuff. One of the things that is pointed out in the Canadian official histories is towards the end of this year, the Canadians become aware of the fact that, gee, Royal Navy, when you finish retrofitting new equipment onto your escorts, you often give them, a month or two worth of workup time, to get back in the saddle here and get ready to go back out to sea. We never get that. We never get that. Even when we slap a new radar set on, we probably go back out to convoy duty the very next week. And so there was a real dichotomy here between the Canadian equipment and just their insane level of operations. I mean, they were just constantly operating. It's very difficult then to put together cohesive tactical groups that have an opportunity to train and exercise together and come up to speed on this mode of warfare. It was very, very difficult.
Yeah, and I suppose they've also got just a manpower issue because if the Royal
Absolutely.
Navy's chucking out, here's the next war emergency flotilla, it's like, okay, we've got another dozen destroyers or a couple of dozen frigates in the mix. Okay, well, we can put like fresh crews on them, but we can supplement that with a few experienced officers here and a few experienced men from here, and it's
Yep.
not massively negatively affecting the rest of the fleet, even though its particular ships will miss particular people. Whereas for the Canadians, the Navy wasn't exactly big to start with, and
Oh,
there isn't an experienced cadre of people for them to draw on to put on all these new ships they're getting.
bingo.
It's almost all fresh, and if they go, okay, well, we're going to take this crew and we're going to split them between the 6 new ships to give each of those ships a little leveling core. Well, now that's a
Yeah.
veteran crew. of one of your better escorts that you now don't have, and now that ship's also got a
Yeah.
green crew.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. And eventually the Canadian Navy is going to be a really, really good Navy, and their ASW prowess is going to be acknowledged by everybody. I mean, they
Mm.
really know what they're doing. But they, like us, are in scramble mode in 1942. It's just a lot of kind of desperate improvisation going on at this point. So, meanwhile, out in the Pacific, um, you put a question in here. What's going on in terms of innovation, and the Americans too are scrambling, and it is amazing the motivation it gives you to innovate when you are getting your butts kicked as badly as we are in the first part of this war. And it's dangerous to, I think, put national stereotypes on navies, but I think it is safe to say that the Americans have a very pragmatic approach to war, that we are completely unsentimental about pointing at things and saying, that doesn't work. I don't care if it's official doctrine. I'm getting rid of that. I'm doing something. I don't care what. Just make it happen. And our Navy too, and this is one of the things that Trent Home points out in his book Learning War. I think the Navy as a pre-war culture was really, really good at accepting innovation. That it was an outfit that was okay with mistakes during exercises. As long as we're learning from those mistakes, that's cool. No one's going to get hung out to dry for that. The result is then that you have a culture that is very good at bubble up sort of innovation. And the classic example of this, I would argue, is what ends up happening between the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway in terms of fuel lines. So you got this gent, Oscar Mayer. Oscar Mayer is the fuel officer on the carrier Yorktown at Coral Sea. And he's there and watching as Lexington burns to the waterline as the result of an uncontrolled avgas fire. And he's like, I do not want that happening to my carrier. And he comes up with this notion of like, what would happen if we pumped our fuel lines full of CO2 and rendered them inert? Would that be a benefit during an enemy attack? And he floats this notion to the damage control officer, and the DCO is like, oh, let's try it. And they do. And by the time that carrier ends up at Midway a month later, that is now standard operating procedure on board the Yorktown, and it saves their lunch, at least temporarily. Um, when Kobayashi's dive bombers come down on that carrier around lunchtime and they smack her a couple of really good hits, and it's pretty arguable that if her fuel lines had been full of avgas at that point, she too would have burned to the waterline and would not then have been the extremely convenient punching bag that Hiryu was going to expend all of her counterattacks on. And, so that CO2 gimmick worked really well. And lo and behold, it becomes standard operating procedure on all of our carriers in very short order because we're like, yeah, that works. Same thing with the fighter tactic, the Thatch Weave, which too was debuted at Midway. Jimmy Thatch bet his life on that tactic, and it saved him and two of his guys from certain extermination. And again, very quickly, that what he called the beam defense tactic is going to be integrated within the fleet, and that's what all of our Wildcat flyers are going to be doing when we go down to Guadalcanal. So I would argue that the Americans are very good at scrambling. We're very good at improvising, and that there's a lot of new stuff that's kind of bubbling up the ranks here in terms of tactical innovations. How do we organize our warships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And I
This is a
think
process. Go
sorry,
ahead.
as I say, when I did a video a little while ago on how on the evolution of carrier air wings in the Pacific, you see that quite a bit because you start off in, I kind of did it. What is the average air wing looking like
Yes.
of the major engagements from Pearl Harbor onwards? And the Japanese, from Pearl Harbor through to the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, there's remarkably little change in the overall makeup of their air groups. They might have fewer aircraft overall, And
Yes.
towards the end, there's slightly more fighters, although honestly, that I think at that point it's probably because there's just some zeros left, whereas the Vals and
Yeah.
the Kates are being exterminated on a regular basis. But they don't really seem to want to change the makeup of their air group. But you watch the US air groups, and very, very quickly they're going, okay, the Devastator is not working. Okay, we're going to switch over to, we're going to just put loads of Wildcats in and almost go with almost a dive bomber fighter mix. And then as the Avengers come in, you can
Yeah.
constantly see they're playing around with, okay, now we've got a torpedo bomber that isn't going to be shot down like a clay pigeon.
Yeah.
But how
Great
do we,
plan.
yeah,
Yeah.
how do we balance that with our Dauntlesses? And is it worth having, VS and VB squadrons, or do we just have a bigger VB squadron? And where do we allocate that? Do we have
Hmm.
more fighters or more torpedo bombers, or a balance? And the air groups are evolving really quickly. And actually the same thing even with the way they're utilizing their air groups, because at Midway, Spruance is the two-thirds of his way through his launch procedure. He's like, stuff this is taking far too long. You lot go, we'll get the rest off later, because there's the
Yep.
doctor get all the planes from the carrier off, and the Japanese obviously at that point are more advanced, sending distinct packs from multiple carriers.
Hmm.
But by the time of Guadalcanal, the U.S. Navy's already trying that
Hmm.
somewhat. They're not as good at it as the Japanese, but hey, the Japanese have had a couple of years of practice at it, so that's not very surprising. But
Well, yes
the
and no. I mean, yeah, and there's a lot we could actually that would be the question that we would want Justin Pike here for
yeah.
is, because um I would actually argue that in terms of unified carrier operations, that innovation really is only a year old at most because, it's the order in April of 1941 that formally constitutes First Air Fleet. And then they've got to figure out how to actually do that. It really isn't until the summer of 41 that people like Genda are like, okay, here's how we're going to run things. Yes, we're going to put together groups of aircraft from multiple carriers, and there's going to be one guy in the air who's going to run that whole schmear. So, anyway, no, you're absolutely right. And of course, to fast forward to 1944, by the time you get there and you got second generation fighters that are all rocking, the Pratt and Whitney R 2800, which has got, 2,000 horse. Now all of a sudden your fighters are light bombers for all intents and purposes. That Corsair can lug a 2,000-pound bomb if it needs to. 1,000 is probably all it would, but that means that the balance of our air wings just gets shifted over dramatically. It's like 70% fighters, and yeah, we'll have 8 or 12, TBFs lying around and some dive bombers too. But man, the more fighters, the merrier, because not only do they defend my fleet, I can also project an offensive firepower, and I can do things like I can take a package of them and go sit them over an enemy airfield on Guam and say, "Welcome home, boys," and right.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
we just couldn't get enough fighters. Just wanted more and more and more fighters. Anyway,
Yeah, and I think
um,
when what you were saying about the development, like the fact the US Navy is willing to accept change very quickly, and I suspect you probably, well, hopefully you saw the same thing developing when you were looking at the Guadalcanal campaign, was
yeah,
that I mean Guadalcanal is a brutally Darwinian process,
yes,
but I think especially for me, when I was looking at what they call the first night battle of Guadalcanal, but they're all at night, but I call it Callahan's action,
yeah,
or he and Kirishima and friends. Um, but you kind of see there's almost a complete contrast there, because you have Admiral Scott, who's been there, and I mean, to be fair, Scott's not seen that many actions at that point,
yeah,
but he's already in the process of completely rewriting the US Navy's night fighting doctrine.
right,
And then you have Callahan, who's kind of I guess at that point he's almost the representative of the pre-war US Navy, in that he's just shown up. He hasn't got any real combat experience outside of reading reports from the front line,
yeah.
and he ends up in charge almost entirely on the basis of seniority. And you can kind of see he I mean, he does make a lot of mistakes. You can kind of see he's trying, but he clearly just doesn't quite have the experience to come up with a coherent battle plan that works at night, versus Scott, who kind of was a
See,
couple steps ahead of him at that point.
let's argue about that
Okay.
because I think. that okay, Callahan, did he have a battle plan? Yeah, I think he does. It was never communicated, so
Mm,
huge, black star for that. You
mm,
got to communicate this thing. But the problem was that the battle plan that he had in mind, I think, was so scary that he didn't want to communicate it because it was terrifying. And again, I'm reading from Trent
mm,
Hohn's playbook on this one. Trent
mm,
argues that on the basis of pre-war wargaming, there were analyses that showed that if you have heavy cruisers and you are in a night action against an enemy fast battleship, if you can close
mm,
to within 6,000 yards, a pair of heavy cruisers will have a firepower advantage over that battleship. But that means, if I'm going to legitimately manage to punch an 8-inch shell through the 8-inch belt of a
mm,
Congo, I got to get within slingshot range of that damn thing, right? And so when Callahan yells at the beginning of this battle, give him hell, we want the big ones,
mm,
that's the battle plan. That's it right there.
mm,
We have to do damage to these two battleships. The result is, of course, just hair raising in that you're essentially, and I don't want to say that Callahan had good control over his fleet. He didn't. He clearly didn't. And he would have done much better to have had himself in a ship with an SG radar so he had a better appreciation for what was going on. But nevertheless, the result was that his formation got rammed into the heart of Admiral Abe's formation. And by hook or by crook, he gets San Francisco to within slingshot range of Hiei and punches holes into her steering compartment, which is really the only way to win this battle. He's got to convince Admiral Abe that my bombardment mission is infeasible. And the only way to do that is to change Abe's mind. And the way to do that is to confuse him and to shoot his flagship full of holes, killed his chief of staff right there on the bridge next to him, you know. So I would actually argue that if Norman Scott had had command of the American formation and had tried to fight a linear medium range engagement against the Japanese, we lose. Okay.
mm.
Because the Japanese have got, all their firepower is at the top and the bottom of the batting order. You've got mucho de guns on these two fast battleships, right? And you got just schools of Type 93s down in the destroyers. They'll crush us at medium range. They'll absolutely destroy us. And so, as blundering a battle plan as Callahan actually has, I think, given the circumstances, we did the best that we could have done, even though it was a complete, a knife fight with the lights shot out in a brawl, in a bar someplace. That's the sort of engagement it was. But it really kind of came out as well as it could have come out, I argue.
Yeah. I mean, I think I definitely agree with you that the not basing himself on a ship with SG radar was a big
Dumb.
issue because
Yep.
you need your situational awareness. For me, I think the thing that tips me personally over from a good plan badly executed to possibly not entirely appreciating how to execute is that at the last minute when he orders, where basically he's ordering alternate ships to fire port and starboard,
Yeah, that's weird.
because it's just like that would
I
be
grant you.
difficult enough to do in daylight, let alone
Right.
at night. Because
Yeah.
at the same time, and I suppose I think there is a certain tradition of this in the U.S. Navy, although the fleet problems in the interwar period are much more geared towards almost set piece engagements a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but certainly in the Royal Navy, and I think in the U.S. Navy as well to a degree, there is this kind of idea of you throw your captains into a situation and you expect them to engage brain and do their duty.
Yeah.
And you kind of see that the US Navy is capable of doing that because you look at the performance of some of the ships, like Helena in that engagement. She takes the idea of let's go out and kill the Japanese Navy very seriously, just
Right.
wandering around obliterating destroyers left, right, and center. And
She's
it's
built
I
for it.
kind of look at it and go, well, if you hadn't confused everybody at the last possible moment and just sort of gone Japanese that way, kill Japanese,
Right.
it probably would have gone somewhat better.
Yeah, no, I'll give you that one. Yeah, for sure. Again, his communication skills were terrible,
Mm,
and we don't really know what his battle plan was. There's one fragmentary remembrance from a sailor on the San Francisco who says that he overheard a conversation between Callahan and Captain Casson Downs on San Fran, and uh, Casson says to Callahan, he's like, "This is suicidal." And Callahan responds, "Yes, I know, but it's what we have to do." So that's about all we know, right?
mm,
And of course, that sailor's account may not even be legitimate. We don't know. That's just ex post facto hearsay. Who knows what he actually witnessed or whether he remembered it correctly? But nevertheless,
mm.
then of course, um, just 2 nights later, we get a complete reversal. Now you've got one of my very, very favorite naval actions of all time. You know, the second
Yeah.
battleship engagement with Willis Lee, who God put on this earth to be to be a battleship admiral. I mean, he was the right guy at the right time. He had a freakish spatial awareness. This is a guy who didn't need to use mobility plotting boards to do unit maneuvers because he could just keep track of all this stuff in his head. Scary intellect, really, really good mathematician. And he's on the Washington, which had probably the best gunnery department of any U.S. battleship at this point in time. I mean, the assistant gunnery officer on that ship was an MIT graduate. I mean, these guys, the combination of them plus Willis Lee just turns this ship into what I call a nautical assassin. I mean, they have these guns so well in alignment and figured out. There's a famous incident right before the battle where they're using the cruiser Atlanta as a firing target. And Lloyd Muston, who's going to go on to he's going to make flag rank after the war too. He's the assistant gunnery officer on the Atlanta. And the game is that, Washington's 35,000 yards that way. And she's going to offset her batteries by a degree or two. And the game is that we're going to try to put our salvos into Atlanta's wake. And Mustin gives this wonderful account where he's like, I'm sitting here watching, and I see the flash of the guns, and then 96 seconds later, down come these salvos just right into our wake, just salvo after salvo after salvo. So, you want to talk about dialed in. Washington was absolutely loaded for bear when she goes into that action against Kondo.
Mm.
And okay, so here's a point where I have real questions about Japan's behavior. It's clear during the Guadalcanal engagement, which goes from, early August, it's going to go all the way to February 43. The really scary time for the US is October, I would say, and really up to these two engagements in mid-November. The Japanese had opportunities to win at Guadalcanal, but they were never mentally willing to push all their chips into the center of the ring, into the center of the table and actually go for it. Whereas if you look at the second battleship engagement from Halsey's standpoint, it still just literally sends shivers up my spine when I think about how insanely dangerous this was for Halsey to send his last two remaining heavy units in the theater into the confined waters of Iron Bottom Sound. Because if you've been there, it's a tiny piece of water. It's only 20 miles less, I think, from Lunga Point over to Tulagi. So a battleship can literally fire a shell from one end of the sound to the other. This thing is a bathtub. And you're essentially locking Willis Lee with these two remaining heavy units into the nautical equivalent of a cage match. There's only three ways out of this sound. If he gets into trouble there, there's no way out. And Japanese prowess in torpedo warfare is just blatantly obvious at this point in time. And yet Halsey was like, I told Archer Vandegrift that I'm going to basically fight down to the last bloody rowboat to keep this island. These are my last two units. Into the ring they go. Whereas the Japanese, on the night when they sent Abe down with just Hiei and Kirishima, Harana and Congo were north at Antong Java Atoll. They could have come along for the party. We just recently found out by looking at Senshi Sosho that the reason that they didn't is because that Type 3 bombardment ammunition that they had used earlier in October, this big
Hmm.
shotgun shell kind of things, were in really short supply. And so Harana and Congo had cross-decked all their ammunition over to Hiei and Kirishima. And as a result, they didn't have the right kind of bombardment ammo, and so they left them riding herd as anti-aircraft escorts for Junyo, which is dumb.
Hmm.
I mean, if you seriously believe that Guadalcanal is the decisive battle, by gummy, you need to push these other two Congos into the ring, and they didn't do it. And ex post facto, I mean, how can Callahan and Scott stand up to four Congos? They can't.
No.
How can Willis Lee beat three if Kondo comes down with those three units? It's really hard to see how he's going to prevail in those conditions either. But it gives you a sense for um, the Americans were more flexible in their approach to understanding the true meaning of this engagement. The Guadalcanal was decisive in their minds. They didn't really care where it happened. We're just interested in seizing the initiative and taking it away from the Japanese. We don't just go do that. The Japanese, on the other hand, you've got this whole body of interwar doctrine around what the decisive battle should look like, and it should be a blue water fleet engagement between big battle lines. And you know, you're telling me that this malarial hellhole down here, that this is the site of a decisive battle? It just doesn't smell like that. And so, even though they gave lip service to that this is decisive, you don't see it in terms of their willingness to actually commit their heavy units to go down there.
Yeah, I think well, I kind of thought of this while you were saying that. It's like the Japanese are fighting each battle at Guadalcanal explicitly with the objective of saving their ships for the last battle, and the
There's
Americans are fighting each battle as if it is the last battle.
right. No, I think that's a good point.
Hmm.
Um, because up at Truck during this very same time, you got Yamato riding at anchor. Mutsu was up there as well, a 16-inch gun
Hmm.
battleship. So those were all available. There were probably fuel constraints too. And do you really want to maneuver six battleships inside Iron Bottom Sound? I mean, that's pretty hairy too. But I think there's sort of a dichotomy within the Japanese. Yeah, they look at Battleship Division 3, which are the older Congos, and they're like, they understand that these are no longer fit to stand in the line of battle alongside Battleships Division 1 and 2. So, to an extent, we're willing to play with them more than we are with units like Yamato and Nagato and Mutsu. We don't want to mess around with that because you're right, if we ever do get into this, mythical blue water fleet action, we got to have those units available because that's how we're going to win that thing. Anyway,
Hmm. It's kind of almost like in computer games where where people get, they'll fight the legendary boss and they'll be down to their last point of health, and someone's
yeah,
like, "Well, you have like 16 med packs in your inventory," and like, "Yeah, but I might need those later."
right.
Squish.
Squish. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, to kind of wrap up 42 from
Hmm.
in the Pacific, I would say that it's still very much a work in progress. And actually, I just saw a really interesting talk out of the Western Naval History Association. A friend of mine, Leonard Hines, gave a
Hmm.
talk on the SG radar, and he talks about the fact that, yeah, the American skippers very quickly picked up on this as a really cool piece of equipment. I want one of those for my ship, but it wasn't a panacea in that it's not good enough to just have the raw technology. You also have to mate it with um, organizational and command and control changes as well. You got to have a combat information center before you can really utilize this thing properly. And so, even though by the end of 42, I would say Willis Lee ends the Guadalcanal campaign for all intents and purposes. That the Japanese initially look at that and they're like, well, yeah, we can continue fighting, and that's the initial game plan. But by the time they get to Christmas, they're just like, no, we just can't do this. We cannot sustain this pounding, and so that ends that campaign. But obviously, the Americans still have a ton to learn in terms of night combat, and there are going to be ugly, ugly surprises for us as we continue moving up the slot and that sort of thing. The other thing that happens, of course, at the end of the year in the Pacific is we're done with carrier warfare for a whole year at this point. You know, both sides' carrier forces have just beaten themselves absolutely bloody. And I call this, this is halftime. Is kind of what it comes down
Yeah.
to. We're not going to fight another carrier battle until the middle of 1944. Of course, in that intervening 18 months, the Americans are essentially going to put together an entirely new Navy in terms of equipment and technology and doctrine and logistical support. And it's just, a whole different kettle of fish when we get out to Philippine Sea. So, meanwhile, trying to think, the Mediterranean
Yeah.
continues struggling along this whole time. And really, the Italians do very, very well, I would argue, for the middle portion of this year. They are able to move cargo down to Libya relatively effectively. They're moving 80, 90,000 tons a month, which, sort of pales in comparison to the 300,000 tons that are being delivered, to the Egyptian docks for Eighth Army. But nevertheless, I mean, they're managing to keep the wheels on in terms of Rommel's offensive and that sort of thing. But things start changing, I guess I would argue, in the July, August timeframe. One of the big changes there, I would say, is a guy named Keith Park shows up to become the fighter commander on Malta. He rolls in the middle of July, and Park is just, he's not necessarily the most pleasant of individuals, I guess, to deal with. But Jesus, I mean, he really understood what he was doing. And he immediately turns around the battering that Malta has been taking from these mixed German-Italian air attacks. I mean, he shoves those attacks all the way back to Sicily and starts going after them. I mean, that's the kind of cat he was. And of course, then you get Pedestal, Operation Pedestal in August, which is, it's really tough to, how do you classify that? Is it a win or a loss? I mean, it was a horrifically expensive operation. And I kind of come down on Vince O'Hara's conclusion that it was the biggest air naval victory by the Axis forces during the year. In that, if you look at the loss rates that the British take running this convoy into Malta, it's worse than PQ-17. And that's really, really bad,
Yeah.
Um, but it does provide enough fuel and avgas and some food supplies and whatnot to keep Malta limping along, which means that now a guy like Keith Park has got enough fuel that he can do what he needs to do. And so slowly Malta begins reassuming its nature that it had back in 1941. Not only does it now project air power against Axis communications, but 10th Submarine Flotilla is going to come back and be based there. And now you got submarines operating around out of there as well. And so what you end up seeing is that whereas the Italians were able to get 80 or 90,000 tons of supplies into the battlefield in the middle of the year, by the time we get to December of 1942, obviously with the Allies having kicked in the back door with the torch landings and that sort of thing, the majority of their supplies are going into Tunisia rather than down into Libya, because Monty is moving to the west at this time too. But the net result is that you've got this really short supply line from Naples to Tunis is, I just measured it this afternoon. It's 307 nautical miles. That's like nothing, right? That's half the distance from Rabaul to Guadalcanal.
Yeah.
But the Italian merchant marine begins calling it the route of death because it is just absolutely harrowing. And in December, they managed to only deliver about 12,000 tons of supplies, and that is not enough to keep a brand new panzer army in operation in Tunisia. So by the time you get to the end of this year, with Torch and Pedestal and Malta reasserting itself and the Italian Navy kind of running out of oil too, so that they really are just handcuffed in terms of heavy fleet operations, it's pretty clear that the whole complexion of the Mediterranean war has now shifted back to the Allies, I would say.
Yeah, I think that looking at the Mediterranean, I think the two things that stood out to me about how the fortunes change in 1942 is firstly with Torch, because when Torch goes down, obviously you have the Battle of Casablanca in Massachusetts merrily shooting its way through most of the Vichy fleet. But you have this other
Tuscaloosa too.
yeah, you
Yeah,
have this other allied force that's standing off in case the Italians try to interfere out at sea. And it's just really interesting for me because up until that point in the Mediterranean, there's kind of been this cat and mouse going on between the Regia Marina and the Royal Navy, sort of bouncing back and forth. And a huge number of the engagements are kind of like one force encounters the other. The stronger force chases the weaker force, who fall back on some of their friends, who then chase the first lot, who
right.
then come back with more of their friends, and it escalates until battleships flinging shells at each other.
Yeah,
But there's always been this kind of it's on a knife edge. We have to be really careful, and both sides are being really careful about not overcommitting where they could be caught out by the other.
yeah,
But then when you get to Torch, it's suddenly, yeah, we can have Ranger and the Sangamons sitting off their operating air support and Massachusetts going in, but we can also have this naval screen, and we're happy that this screen can actually just stop the Regia Mariner dead if they want to,
yeah,
while also having Force K, while also having the Mediterranean fleet building up. And it's suddenly these are the resources that you need to be able to start closing the Mediterranean down.
yeah,
And it's something that just wasn't there previously. And
yeah,
the other element is, of course, like you said, with the supplies, in that up until this point, the Desert War has kind of, well, except for the slightly weird interlude where we sent most of the desert troops off to fight in Greece for some reason. But there you go. But other than that, most of the war had kind of been, British forces go west, eventually outrun their supply lines. Germans and Italians come back
yeah,
east. They outrun their supply lines,
yeah,
and back and forth it goes. Um, and it's not for lack of trying on the Mediterranean fleet's part to keep everybody supplied, but the port
yeah,
facilities just aren't there. And to be honest, neither is the shipping with the attrition rate from Italian and German bombers. But then again, in 1942, you get suddenly this thing of, well, okay, not only is Montgomery getting enough resources on hand that he can plan for set piece battles with the Germans, where it's not a case of, well, I think we'll attack here or I think we'll attack there. It's
no,
almost World War One-ish of like, I will fling enough artillery to level the landscape and then
yep,
we shall attack. Uh,
yes,
while also simultaneously putting together this whole invasion force at the other end of the Mediterranean
yep,
to secure Torch. And then, you know, they say logistics wins wars, but that's kind of the example of it at that point. It's like, well, we have three times as many resources as you do, so now we're coming at you from both sides. Good luck with that.
yep, yeah. Yeah, one of the other interesting aspects of Torch 2 is how miserably the U-boats fail to do anything meaningful to that invasion force.
Hmm.
And that's a real eye opener, I think, for the Kriegsmarine and certainly for Hitler. That, they made an all out effort to go after us. And sorry, yes, we had to denude a lot of our escort groups in the Western Atlantic, and even the Canadians are,
Hmm.
they're bringing a sizable contingent over and are in essence kind of lying to their own parliament about where their ships are being used. But everybody understood that, if we can get into North Africa here, just from a logistical standpoint too, if we can clear the Mediterranean, that means that I no longer have to send all these ships around the Cape of Good Hope. That whittles off millions of ton miles. And shipping is the lifeblood of everything that we do in the Western Alliance. I mean, it's everything. So, being able to free up that number of ton miles, that's a huge achievement. I realized that we somehow got out of the Pacific without even uttering the word Midway, well, or a little bit of Midway, or we should at least talk
Yeah.
about the significance of that battle.
Mm.
Midway to me is not a turning point. I've said this a bazillion times. It is the most important naval battle of the entire war. I will grant that. But the reason it is important is because of the knock-on effects that it has with respect to Guadalcanal. Midway is the gift that keeps on giving, in that it allows us to create a Guadalcanal within just 2 months of having won that battle. Because again, everything that Ernie King wants to do at this point in the war is all about seizing the initiative from the Japanese and turning this thing around so that I'm putting you guys on the defensive and just stoking up the attritional machinery and starting to give you the business. Never would have been able to do that at Guadalcanal if we don't win at Midway. So you definitely see a maturation despite the warts, despite Hornets, flight to nowhere, and all that stuff. I mean, the U.S. carrier force is definitely getting its legs underneath it by that time. And it's clear that our old cadre of aviators, cats like Dick Best and Dusty Cleese and those guys are very, very, very good. So that, is kind of the, what I say, the winning combination there. It's a combination of, yeah, it's great to have good operational intelligence, but you also have to have operators like Dick Best and good fleet commanders too, and Fletcher and Spruance, who can put together this package of capabilities that can clearly measure up to Kita Butai. So that's a big it's a big step forward, I guess I would say, but it does not obviously end the war overnight or really
Mm.
dramatically change the conditions at sea, insofar as we're not supreme in terms of flight decks. What we have now is parity, but parity in the middle of this horribly awful year, that was a wonderful thing to be at, because it allows us to get out of this defensive crouch that we've been in and start contemplating undertaking counteroffensives of our own. And that leads directly to Guadalcanal, which is the most important naval campaign in the Pacific, I would argue, even more so than the Marianas.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing, the more like on my fourth read through of Shattered Sword, I suddenly realized something which came to me after also looking at the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, and I thought, well, hang on a minute. If Midway goes badly for the US, or even if it doesn't go badly, if it's just, roughly speaking, a score draw, that has actually tremendous long-term implications, because even if we assume for some reason that the Japanese are like, well, you know what, we're not going to send, you know, Kagahiri, sorry, we're not going to send them to Guadalcanal, even if we let Guadalcanal play out just as it does with the Shikakus and Hio and Jun.
Mm-hmm.
Um, by the end of 1942, both navies are down to two operational fleet carriers.
Yep.
And I know your opinion on whether Hio and Junior count as fleet carriers. We had to the deliberately
Yeah.
leaving them out.
Right.
But it, as you say, it kind of puts, when the rebuilding effort starts in 43, it puts everyone at kind of the same point, except for the fact that the Japanese only really have Taiho in the pipeline, and the US has, the ridiculous numbers of Essexes and Independences.
Right.
Whereas if the Japanese don't lose Midway the way that they do, if they have four additional fleet carriers going into
Yeah.
43, that means it's not a case of, okay, Essex is here, great, now we have +1, and as Intrepid and so on and so forth show up, it's now +2, +3, +4. It would be a case of, We've now got the first four Essexes. We're now only just about at parity with the Japanese. Then Taiho comes in, so we need another Essex.
Yep.
At which point, not only are that's going to delay what the Navy is feeling safe in doing in terms of offensive actions for quite a while.
I agree.
Um, but it's also going to be a case of you are going to have another midway style big mass action between lots of carriers a heck of a lot earlier than you do with Philippine Sea and with a lot less favorable odds.
No, I think that's all very accurate. Um, yeah, just being given that gift of the Japanese, in essence, throwing away their trump card after just 6 months. That's enormous for us, and allows us again to set up this attritional machinery. One of the points I make in my book is that if you look at the sort of the character of the Pacific War up to this point, it's been very episodic for us. There's been, some ground combat, obviously, in the Philippines that was over by most of it was over by the middle of April.
Mm.
And we've done some carrier raids around the perimeter. Now we fought these two big carrier battles. But if you are the United States and you know that within reasonably short order, you are going to be the bigger, stronger, heavier opponent, the classic play that you want to do is get your smaller opponent in a headlock someplace and just start giving them the business, right? Because at the end of the day, Japan remains a modern industrial state. And the only way to bring such an entity to ruin is to grind its military to kibble and put your forces adjacent to the home islands so that you can either bomb it to ruin or invade it or both. That's how this war is going to have to end, which means that we need a sausage grinder. Someplace we need to be in daily contact with the Japanese military. I need to be rolling out of bed every morning knowing that today is going to be a great day because I'm going to be killing Japanese soldiers and shooting down their aircraft and hopefully getting into naval fracases on a relatively frequent basis. That's how we're going to win this war, is to begin the bloody business of just grinding their military up. And Midway gives us not one but two sausage grinders within 2 months. The first, of course, at Guadalcanal, and the second the Japanese create for themselves in New Guinea by starting their
Mm.
campaign over the Owen Stanley Mountains, which is another one of those sort of, geez, guys, if you just could have waited, 3 more weeks before you made that decision, you would have seen us landing on Guadalcanal, and you might have thought better about trying to, undertake this campaign in New Guinea. You could have focused solely on Guadalcanal instead, and you might have had different results. But no.
Yeah, I
So
think I think sometimes people forget about the sheer scale of the Pacific land campaigns because obviously everyone has heard of the sea campaigns, but you know New Guinea or Papua New Guinea as it is these days, um, you know I looked at its dimensions like that's a surface area that's equivalent to the Western Europe.
right,
Um, it's like, you think about how many resources were thrown into the liberation of France and the Low Countries, then eventually invading Germany after with D-Day a couple of years down the line. It's like this is an equivalent landmass area that's being
yeah,
fought over while the Japanese are also fighting in China, while they're also fighting in Burma. It's like you've got three absolutely colossal continental scale land campaigns going on, plus all the island defenses.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
it's not just a case of well this fleet beats that fleet game over. It's there's millions of men on both sides on the ground as well.
absolutely. Yeah. Even by the time you get to the middle of 1944, the U.S. Army has 1.8 million service personnel in the Pacific. That's a
Mm,
lot of troops. And yeah, the Marine Corps gets a lot of the press, but they're only three or 400,000. I mean, they punch well above their weight,
mm,
obviously, but yeah, we have a lot of Army troops there. And to your point too, the Japanese never have fewer than about 1.5 million troops in both the China Expeditionary Army and the Kwantung Army. So it's a huge manpower sump for them, and there's constant combat going on over there too. So anyway, um, yeah, didn't want to. I know you would end up getting comments. How the hell can you talk about 1942 and not talk about Midway?
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
there
That
you go.
this wouldn't do.
Yeah. So
Meanwhile, go
we've
ahead.
looked. Yeah, like I say, we looked at the Pacific, we've looked
Yeah,
at the Mediterranean, and I guess that leaves us technically with the Atlantic, but also the Arctic convoys, because
yeah,
the Arctic doesn't necessarily go to quite so well either.
no,
Um,
no, it really doesn't, does it? PQ-17, what a what a mess. What a mess. That's July of 1942, and we end up losing, two-thirds of that convoy under just scandalous circumstances, I would argue. Tirpitz and her consorts were definitely in a position to pay a calling, and then they were moving towards this convoy, and the result is that Dudley Pound tries running this battle by remote control and prematurely orders the convoy to scatter. And the result is, just heartrending. I mean, they just,
mm,
the U-boats and the air units. I forget which Flieger Corps it is that it's up in Norway at that point in time. They just rip this convoy apart, and of course you've got this really good um, book written by the screen commander. Oh God, I'm spacing his name now. It's a wonderful book.
mm,
Convoy is to scatter.
yeah.
You talk about a heartrending event from their standpoint too. I mean, they felt humiliated that they took their destroyer screen and basically went home, without any sort of a battle, just leaving this convoy to their own devices, and they just get absolutely shellacked. That puts a very sour taste in Ernie King's mouth, I will mention too.
Mm,
I look at that as being sort of that's the death knell as far as King wanting to put heavy units up at Scapa Flow, because very shortly after that, we're going to cut orders to bring WASP and Washington out to the Pacific. It doesn't hurt, of course, that we've got a rapidly evolving campaign that's about to kick off at
mm.
Guadalcanal too. But yeah, the Arctic convoys actually had been milk runs up until PQ-17, and then yeah, PQ-17 was like, holy crap, what's going on with that? And PQ-18 ain't much better.
No, it's one of the things when I was looking at PQ-17 is that the I think the biggest tragedy of it is that Tirpitz, as you said, it doesn't actually end up coming out fully
Right.
because
It
you
gets
end up
spooked.
therefore with the worst of both worlds because if you have the the Wichita and the other big cruisers in kind of the standoff escort group.
Tuscaloosa, I think, was
Yeah.
named too. Yep.
Um, and you've got two US and two British cruisers in the kind of the near escort, I would say, and then you've got the close escort of the destroyers and such like. And when they sail off, they're they're thinking based on the Admiralty signals, they're thinking that Tirpitz and her battle group are about to appear over the horizon at any
That's
moment,
exactly right.
and
Yep.
they're kind of they've agglomerated into the biggest, best force they can for a kind of a do or die suicide charge at this monstrous German capital ship and
Yep.
whatever French she's brought with her. So they're quite prepared to sell their all their lives in defense of the convoy. And if if history had played out that way, of yeah, PQ-17 got obliterated by U-boats and aircraft after its escort valiantly sold itself to see off Tirpitz, it would
Whole
be a
different thing.
completely different story. But
Yeah.
instead, they end up sailing after a ship that isn't actually there,
Right.
and then get told to go home,
They're
which
too
means they
far
don't get
away at this
yeah
point. There was
they
no way to reform that
yeah,
convoy. Couldn't
they
get
don't
back
get
to.
to do anything, and the convoy just gets hit anyway.
Yeah. Jackie Broom. I had to
Mm,
look up his name
mm,
just because his book is wonderful. He's
yeah.
he's a good cartoonist too.
Mm.
It's a wonderful, wonderful book. Yeah, that was just the blackest day in the Navy. At one point, Jackie Broom, right after they're given the order to scatter, he sends a signal over to the destroyer Somali, and his signal is, "What part of the bloody war plan is this?"
Mm.
And Somali's reply is unprintable, but it's just it was absolutely ignominious. And you know, here's a case where the intel that Pound had to hand was not giving him the accurate picture, and
Mm.
he is trying to run things by remote control, which is it's understandable. I mean, Tirpitz is big and scary. I get that. Although, from the American standpoint, of course, I look at Tirpitz and I'm like, South Dakota would make mincemeat out of that
Mm.
thing. Just blow her out of the water. The Iowas certainly would. They weren't around at the time. But I understand where the Admiralty was kind of uptight because King George V class battleships did not stack up particularly well against that particular beastie. So yeah, I kind of get it, but the result was an absolute debacle.
Yeah, it's one of those really annoying situations because obviously theoretically you've got other German heavy units in play. Tirpitz is the big
Sure,
one. Um,
sheer and yeah,
and yeah, so it's one of those when you look at the situation, I always wonder because of course Pound very shortly after this will retire and then almost immediately die from what turns out to be a massive brain tumor.
yeah,
And looking at his decision making at the beginning of the war, and then as it gets closer and closer to this point, obviously I'm no medical expert, but the, I'm the way he always changes how he handles the war, and the way he gets almost not quite paranoid, but as you know, very micromanaging.
yeah.
I almost wonder, like, how much of an effect was that undiagnosed brain tumor having on his judgment at that stage? Which, of course,
Well,
it's not helping anybody else,
right,
regardless of whether there's a reason for it. But it does make me wonder how much of it was that as opposed to the pound that we would have had in 3940.
right, yeah, and the fact that he was nodding off at staff meetings, was that the tumor? He also
Mm,
had a hip condition, he was not sleeping well at night, and so this is a guy that's just being absolutely run ragged. Yeah, here's a case where there really could have stood to have been an earlier replacement of Pound with a more
mm.
vigorous replacement. Yeah, it didn't do anybody any favors in that
Yeah.
regard.
Mind you, the Royal Navy, to be fair, in terms of its absolute senior cadre of admirals, was running the cupboard a little bit bare, even by the time the war starts. Because I mean, it's another thing that I've reflected on with when you look at the late war and immediate post-war period.
Yeah,
The fact that people like Spruance make it to a good old age is actually um, that's the outlier. You get people like Lee,
he was
and
dead
to
before the surrender.
yeah, and people
Yeah,
and to an extent people like Turner, but an awful lot of the higher cadre of the US Navy after fighting a war for what, 42, 43, 44, 45, 3.5,
yeah,
years, an awful lot of them are basically either dead right before or right after the war, or have massively shortened lifespans compared to what you'd expect, almost certainly from all the stress that they've gone through.
agreed.
Um, and the
Well,
Royal Navy,
and everybody smoked back then
oh
too. I
yeah,
mean, yeah, that's what killed Willis
yeah.
Lee for sure. I mean, he was a chain smoker. So
Yeah, and then you've got the Royal Navy, which has been, I mean, obviously they've been fighting a little bit longer, but also they've been desperately trying to rearm during the 30s. And looking at the build-up, I mean, you had William Fisher, who would have been an absolutely brilliant First Sea Lord, dead, probably through stress, a mixture of age and stress in the late 30s. His replacement Backhouse comes in, also a very good admiral, essentially tries to throw everything together in late 38, 39. Poor old Cunningham in his biography talks about being an assistant to Backhouse in early 39. And they're sitting there going, okay, what are our war plans to deal with Germany and Italy?
mm,
And Cunningham literally opens a cupboard and there's nothing because up until that point, the Royal Navy's what war plans they have are ironically enough to fight Japan.
right.
There's a
And we're
little bit
banking
to
on the French
Yeah, there's a
too.
little bit to deal with the Italians based off what they've learned with the Abyssinia crisis. But
Yeah,
other than that, it's been, yeah, we've got the French and we'll make it up as we go along if it comes to it, because surely, with the size of the Kriegsmarine in 1939, Hitler's not going to be dumb enough to try and fight both the Marine Nationale and the Royal Navy at the same time. Spoiler alert.
Spoiler
um,
alert.
yeah, but so
Exactly.
Backhouse is trying to come up with an actual war plan and get the Royal Navy into shape. Then he keels over and dies. so
Yeah, I
so it's
didn't know
like
about
Admiral
that, but
Pound is kind of the option C for First
yeah,
Sea Lords, and he has a brain tumor. So I think it's something a lot of people don't realize, like the human toll of the stress of fighting a global war on the back foot,
right.
where basically every plan you've made at the start has gone up in smoke.
Hmm.
Literally, in the case of the British, it's like, well, great, Vichy France hates us now. And for the
Right.
Americans, Pearl Harbor, it's like everyone's sitting there going, whatever plans we had are pretty much useless at this point. Now
Yeah.
we're making it up as we go along, while it looks like the Axis is an unstoppable juggernaut.
Right. Right. Which which then goes back to, we talked about this sort of this
Mm,
hideous run that
mm,
the Royal Navy has at the beginning of the year. And, proper props need to be given to the Royal Navy for, yeah, all of our plans went up in ashes. And yet, you know, they fought successfully. Paul Kennedy has this wonderful quote that he's like, that the Royal Navy fought with a ruthlessness that it had never had in the First World War. His backs were to the wall, and somehow by hook or by crook, they managed to come through this year in some sort of shape, and things are looking better, except in the Atlantic, I would
yeah.
argue. Um,
Yeah.
ex post facto, you can kind of look back at where we're at in December of 42, and there are a number of good things that are coming together for the Allies at this point in
Mm,
time. We've compromised four rotor Enigma, so Triton is now compromised. Of course, the Germans don't know that. That's a big deal because, of course, the Germans had compromised the British convoy codes, and so now there was sort of it had been a one-way street because Enigma had been, I forget exactly when in 42 it goes dark. It's like March or April or something like that when they switch over to Triton. Now we've, got some operational intelligence coming back online. So that's good. I would argue too that by the time you get to the end of 42, the U-boats that the Germans have, the 7 and the 9, are both increasingly technologically obsolescent. That we are coming into the party with centimetric radar. We're starting to mount Squid and Hedgehog. We've got more Huff Duff units. We're getting better air patrol. We got innovations like putting the lay light and forward looking radar on our patrol planes now, which is going to turn the Bay of Biscay into a shooting gallery. And yeah, okay, the Germans come up with METOX. You've got this crappy little wooden cruciform that lets you detect these. It's the rinkiest dink device I think okay, it sort of works, that's great, but you can sort of see that the scale of technological advancement in this war is the dice are getting much more heavily loaded on the Allied side of things than they are the Germans. That, yeah, the snorkel will eventually make things a little bit better, but honestly, they needed the Type 21 and they needed it right now, and there's no way in hell, of course, that they were going to get that.
mm,
Um, So yes, the Black Gap is a real problem for the Allies, and we need to be clear that there was no sense of complacency on the part of the Allies at this point in time. In fact, we were scared to bits because the losses on the North Atlantic convoy lines had been terrible. And of course, we're going to have a really rough go in the spring of 1943, and then it's all going to fall apart for the Germans at that point. But nobody knows that, right? I
no.
mean,
Mm,
from our standpoint, I mean, just the mere fact that when we sit down at the Casablanca conference at the beginning of 43, you know, item number one on what the navies have got to do in 43 is get rid of the U-boat threat. Because again, shipping is the basis upon which everything is predicated for us. And we just got to get this taken care of.
yeah, I
Um,
think from a Royal Navy perspective, towards the end of 42, I mean, one of the things I find eternally amusing dash also slightly frustrating is the number of plans the Royal Navy draws up to have a meaningful battle fleet in the Indian Ocean to kind of counterpunch the Japanese from behind. And it's like every other month, they're like, okay, that lot last plan didn't work out very well, but now we think we can have three or four carriers, maybe five, and we can get four, five, six. So at one point, they're looking at like seven battleships and four carriers, and everyone's like, "Oh, that could be really scary." And every
Yeah,
time they come up with a plan, something comes along to horribly derail it. Either a carrier gets battered in the Mediterranean, or
right,
people get called away to Torch, or the Italians put a torpedo into Nelson. Um,
right.
and it's like every single time they're like, yes, we can finally we can be an equal partner in the Pacific. We can crush the Japanese. Oh, and someone's gonna
Um,
ruin
no,
it.
yeah.
um,
Well, and I hate to be mean about it too, but it's one thing to put capital ships out in the Indian Ocean, but
mm.
the Royal Navy just didn't have the logistical woof to operate in that theater, really.
Well,
It's
yeah, that
just
that was the thing that finally put pay to it. To the end of 42, they were finally beginning to go, oh, actually, we could maybe deploy a fairly significant force. And then someone goes, yeah, we need 50 more tankers to move the fuel to Ceylon. And like, oh, yeah, that's something we don't have yet.
yeah. I mean, and understandably too, a lot of British warships were designed with the Atlantic and the Mediterranean as their preferred operating environments. So they just didn't need the range. I mean, yes, the book value says that a tribal class destroyer has got about the range of a Fletcher, but brother, it just ain't so.
Mm,
I know that for a fact. So, and we end up then actually with one of my favorite naval battles of the whole year, which is the
mm.
Battle of the Barents Sea,
Yeah.
um, which I this is just one of those instances where you've got some really appealing personnel on the British side.
Mm,
You've got Robert Burnett is running this cruiser force. Although I do have to say that the British really did have a predilection for every one of these convoys that's going up to Murmansk. We've
mm.
got distant cover forces and this cruiser force, and it's just put the bloody escorts with the bloody convoy, would you? So that if you get into trouble, you've got some gunfire here. I
Mm,
understand with the case of battleships, you don't want them within the air envelope of Norway. I get that. But come on.
mm,
Anyway, so this not a lot of people know about this battle, I don't think. You've got, two different convoys, JW 51A and B going in different directions over to Murmansk, and the Germans managed to get the Lutzow and the Hipper. I had no idea until I really looked into it just how big those German heavy cruisers were. These
yeah.
are 18,000-ton ships full load. I mean, they're the biggest heavy cruisers in the world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's one of the things I like to poke German fanboys with occasionally because I'm just like, who did people sometimes come back at me when I criticize the Bismarcks for being inefficient ships,
Yeah,
given their firepower per ton. But it's like, to be honest, compared to the Hippers, the Bismarcks are the epitome of German efficiency. It's like these things are. I mean, and they keep getting bigger. Like Hipper is
yeah,
one weight, then Blucher is heavier, and Prince Eugen is heavier, and
heavier.
Seydlitz was going to be heavier still.
Yeah,
And you're talking about ships that are displacing about as much as an Invincible class battle cruiser.
carrying 8-inch guns.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
fundamentally, they're not offering any better protection or firepower or anything really than your generic 10,000-ton treaty cruiser. And then the sort of the pièce de résistance I always think to that is you look at the Baltimore class, and it's like one more gun, bit faster, much better armor, much better AA, all around
oh,
a better ship.
her secondaries are just in a
Yes,
completely different league for
yeah,
anybody else's heavy cruisers. Yeah,
and it's 13,000 tons and change. It's like you can fit almost an entire Atlanta in the gap between Prince Eugen and a
right,
Baltimore.
right, right. Yep, yep. So anyway,
Mm,
this convoy gets ambushed, and Lutzow and Hipper close in. Burnett with his two cruisers is north
mm,
of the force by about 30 miles. They've just come out of a storm. They don't even know where the convoy is. And you've got the escort commander Robert Sherbrooke is in the Onslaught. They've got six British destroyers and a couple of Flower
Mm.
class corvettes against a pocket battleship, the Hipper, and six of these great big German destroyers. I mean, this is a walkover in the making. But as per usual, the Royal Navy is doing all of these sort of feint. I'm going to fake that I'm going to do a torpedo attack. Lay down a smoke screen and come charging out and look like I'm going to, and then I run back in the smoke screen and but it's going badly eventually.
Mm.
Eventually Onslaught takes some hits, and Hipper is beginning to wear this force down. Meanwhile, Lutzow is kind of blundering around in the snowstorm, can't really find anything. Burnett, God bless his soul, sees anti-aircraft fire and stuff going off down in the south. He's like, I don't know what that is, and he thinks about it, and then he does. God bless him. It's just like you can't go far wrong by just going to the sound of the guns, and hauls this force out of line and takes them down south, approaches Hipper from behind in the blind dark of her radar. And then I do have a warm spot in my soul for these 6-inch gun light cruisers that both the American and the British navies have, 12 6-inch guns. And when Sheffield and Jamaica open up on Hipper, they just, yeah,
Mm.
the water columns are starting to do this thing. And then, of course, the best episode I think of the whole thing is when Friedrich Eckholt and another of the destroyers that have been busily off sinking a minesweeper, the poor old Bramble with all hands, try to come in, and they mistake Sheffield and Jamaica as their mates and try to, fall into
Right.
column, and are very quickly disabused of any notions of comradely, good
Mm.
feeling on the part of Burnett's force. I love the fact that Burnett was kidded throughout his career as not being necessarily the sharpest tool in the shed. He joked about himself that his brains were in the seat of his pants, but
Mm.
he was lucky. He was brave. He did the right thing, and he ends up winning this engagement, which has huge knock-on effects for the Kriegsmarine. Hitler just
Mm.
completely freaks out. He is going to order all of the heavy warships to the breakers. That's the end of Admiral Rader's career. Donitz
Mm.
now will be the head of the Kriegsmarine. And yes, eventually Donitz convinces the Fuhrer, you really shouldn't scrap these ships. That's kind of a bad move. But Vince O'Hara points out that up into this battle, Barents Sea, there have been 29 surface actions with the Kriegsmarine, and a third of them involved units of cruiser size or larger. After this engagement, there are going to be another 37 surface actions, but only one is going to involve a heavy unit. So that's a real switcheroo in terms of the potential lethality of Germany's surface fleet, which is
Mm.
important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, again, it's kind of the knock-on effects of initially the kind of freeze on operations, which gives everyone a bit of breathing room, and
Mm-hmm.
then while Tirpitz and until pretty much a year later, Scharnhorst, when she gets put down, while they remain threats, it's kind of the overall reduction in the actual threat level of the Kriegsmarine means that the Allies can then do other things like prepare for D-Day, sort
Exactly.
out the landings in Sicily and Salerno, um, and it's all about freeing up resources because the Allies are fighting. Conventionally, yes, they're fighting in Europe and in the Pacific, but in actual fact, you're fighting an Arctic war, an Atlantic U-boat war, a war to secure the North Sea, and now you're preparing to also eventually fight a war to secure the beaches of Normandy, while you're
Yeah.
also securing the Western Mediterranean and the Eastern Mediterranean, and invading Italy, and keeping the Indian Ocean and the South Atlantic free. And you're fighting a land war in Burma, and you're helping the Chinese, and you're fighting a land war
Yeah.
in New Guinea, and you're fighting in the Central Pacific, and it's all adding up.
It's all interconnected. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this book, frankly, was that I feel that we have a tendency to overfocus on singular campaigns and then lose the interconnection points. Like, for instance, um, In the middle of 1942, one of the reasons that Marshall was okay to go along with the Guadalcanal campaign was that he thought it would be of assistance to the Chinese. If we can create enough problems for the Japanese, that means that the Chinese will stay in the war, and we desperately need the Chinese to stay in the war to act as, I hate to say it, a punching bag, so that the Japanese are busy enough there that they're not going to make any monkey business up in Manchuria and potentially knock the Russians out of the war. So there are all of these interconnections. Yeah, there are a lot of really interesting connections in this year, I think, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to do the book. I think that I hate to say it, but I think sometimes there's an overemphasis on the Eastern Front as being the be all end all of the whole
Mhm.
war. And I just don't buy that. I think that the Eastern Front is obviously incredibly important, but there were a lot of other things going on in this war simultaneously that impacted the Eastern Front. I mean, I haven't even talked about Lend-Lease and that kind of thing either. So anyway, that's one of the reasons for doing it. But I guess I would say, by the time you get to the end of this year, it's pretty clear that not only on land but also at sea, the Allies are in a much better position than they had been. I don't think that you can point to any one battle or any one thing that makes that true. It's too big and too complex a war for that to be the case. But, by hook or by crook, little by little, all of the important Allied navies have made important strides. Even, the Canadians are starting to
Mm,
get better equipment too, things like
mm.
that. And so we're starting to put together this sort of winning package, I guess I would say. There obviously is a lot of hard fighting left to come. It's not over, but yeah, we're definitely in a much better position than we had been.
Yeah, and I mean it kind of you kind of when you look at the start and end of 1942, there's so many sort of dichotomies there because you've got the start of 1942, you've got U-boats everywhere, you've got German capital ships potentially everywhere except for Bismarck. By the end of 42, you've got Barents Sea and essentially the Kriegsmarine surface forces being run off the high seas for a bit.
Yeah.
You start off 42 with the Japanese looking like an unstoppable juggernaut. By the end of 42, you've ground down the Kido Butai to a point where it's now score draw. But hey, guess who's got more holes on the slipways? um, and the same thing is, the Mediterranean, the start of 42, you've got convoys being battered left, right, and center. You've got the Regia Marina, putting quite a lot of ships out. By the end of 42, you've got whole screens of Allied capital ships deployed on both sides of the Mediterranean, and you've got preparations being made for landings. The further, obviously, you've got Torch, but you've also got the advances in North Africa that will eventually lead to the landings in Sicily and so forth.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. I
and
mean, at this point, the Mussolini government has got 7 months left to live.
hmm,
It's hard to believe that at this point in time, but that's where we're at.
yeah,
And and go ahead.
yeah, I guess, and you just look at the tactics as well. I mean, not only will the Allies will not suffer a capital ship loss
Right.
after this point, but
Yeah.
the advances in the tactics against U-boats, against for night fighting, carrier fighting doctrine, the even though in some ways the Allied navies are reduced by the losses of late 41 and early 42, numerically, especially at the top end, the efficiency of the fighting forces that are left coming
Yeah.
out of 42 going into 43 is it's like night and day, and that's
Yeah.
going to inform everything that comes afterwards.
Yep. No, I think, and that's a very important point that, efficiency is one of those words that doesn't get the kind of play that it should. But again, in an attritionally oriented war, the side that has even marginally better efficiency of doing things, and I talk about this actually in the air combat in the Solomons, that if you look at combat as being essentially two teams coming to the table and everybody's got, their dice, right?
Mhm.
Each pilot is going to go up in the air and they're going to do their thing. But if my search and rescue program in the Solomons is plucking more of my aviators out of the water than the Japanese are, And if my field hospital is slightly better stocked with atabrine, which brings down the level of malaria in my troops, if my aviators and mechanics are getting a few extra 100 calories a day because we're getting more supplies into Guadalcanal than they are, all of those things are cumulative. It means that instead of having a dozen wildcats over Henderson, maybe I've got 14 or 15. And that means I've got that many more dice to play with today, you
Mm,
know? And so little increases, a percent or two here or there, again, in the grand scheme of the attritional way that we're fighting this thing can have enormous impact. So efficiency is the key to all of that.
yeah. And I think yeah, that dice analogy really, at least to me, it certainly makes sense. I know a lot of my audience as well will be players of tabletop war games and things, and it's kind of, yeah, put yourself in the mind of a Japanese Navy or a US Navy pilot,
Mhm.
and you got Wildcats and Zeros. Yeah, the Wildcat's more heavily armored, but the Zero's flinging 20 millimeter shells. So let's say you're both shot down. So let's put it in a wargaming context. So you both roll a d6, a six-sided dice. Let's say you get a four up and you live. Great, fantastic. You've survived ejection. But now, well, you probably ejected over the Pacific. Are you going to get eaten by sharks? If you're
Right.
Japanese, sorry, bad luck
Yeah.
there. Um,
Yeah. Bad luck.
uh,
Sorry.
Whereas for the US Navy, it's like, well, now you get to roll another dice to see if a submarine picks you up. And then, assuming that you're the miracle Japanese pilot who makes it ashore, like you said, it's like, okay, you now contracted a deadly infection because, hey, you're in the tropics.
Yeah.
With the US, you get another dice set roll to save because you have more advanced medication. And
Yeah.
again, with the Japanese, you're a bit out of luck. The mosquitoes will get you. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah,
All the
on a one pilot scale, maybe that doesn't make so much of an issue because it's very easy for you to fail one or both of those extra dice rolls you get. But when you're rolling 50 dice, 100 dice, 200 dice for all the pilots you've gone down in that month, suddenly that's
Yep.
a whole lot more extra pilots who are coming back.
You got it. Yep. Absolutely. Which, to sort of use the bomber,
Mm,
excuse me, the bomber
mm,
command analogy. Yeah, okay, we can deal with 3% attrition. 4% is about the max we want to get. You start getting to 5 or 6%, it's amazing how quickly your force evaporates in that sort of an
mm,
environment. So, yeah, efficiency again, combat efficiency, just being able to do things more efficiently than the enemy is just hugely important in this war.
mm.
I would end here with just two quotes because I think it is apparent to both sides by the time you get to the end of this year that fundamentally the complexion of this thing has changed. And so the first I would offer you is actually from Alan Brooke from his diary, writing on January 1st, 1943. He says, New Year's started. I cannot help glancing back on January 1st last year when I could see nothing but calamities ahead. Hong Kong gone, Singapore going, Java, etc., very doubtful, even Burma unsafe. Would we be able to save India and Australia? Horrible doubts, horrible nightmares, which grew larger and larger as the days went on, till it felt as if the whole empire was collapsing around my head. And now, we start 1943 under conditions I would never have dared to hope. Russia has held, Egypt for the present is safe. There's a hope of clearing North Africa of the Germans in the near future. The Mediterranean may be partially opened. Malta is safe for the present. We can now work freely against Italy, and Russia is scoring wonderful successes in southern Russia. We are certain to have many setbacks to face, many troubles, and many shattered hopes, but for all that, the horizon is infinitely brighter. Meanwhile, you've got Admiral Ugaki Motome writing in his cabin in around the end of the year in on Yamato. The year 1942 is going to pass tonight. How brilliant was the first stage operation up to April, and what miserable setbacks since midway in June. The invasions of Hawaii, Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia, liberation of India, and destruction of the British Far Eastern Fleet have all scattered like dreams. Looking back over all these, my mind was filled with deep feelings, though it's the fortunes of war, it's most regrettable. So there you have it.
Well, sums it all up. And if you want to hear more, well, there's going to be the book coming in about a
Yep.
year's time.
About a,
Keep an eye out on the channel. You will see it publicized when we have release dates and so forth.
appreciate
And
that.
yeah, and
I
well,
would say to that point too, I do have a website for the book,
there you
1942book.com. So
go.
1942book.com. If you're interested, please put your name on the mailing list there. I'll be giving some updates along the way here when we start getting into the editorial process with the book. But thank you very much for considering it.
No worries. All right. Okay. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Just over 2 hours of the great Jon Parshall again. And well, you never know. He might come back another time if you ask nicely enough.
Yes, be happy to.
See you all later. Bye.
Take care.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.